Welcome to Kron's Honor, Viking historical fiction. Written by Bjorn Wolfe. Narrated by R.K. Marks. Copyright 2023 by Audiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit Audiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.
Chapter 1. The Family and Early Wars. Once upon a time, there lived a man by the name of Mjolnir. He was the son of Gudrun Clumsyfoot and the grandson of Ivar Horsetail. Mjolnir had a sister named Gudbjorg, who was the mother of Gudbrand Nob, who in turn was the father of Asta, the mother of King Olaf the Saint. Mjolnir's mother hailed from Upplands, while his father's relatives were mainly situated in Rogaland and Hordaland. Mjolnir was a renowned Viking, who frequently embarked on expeditions in the west over the sea. He had a few companions with him, including Balki, the son of Blaying from Sotanes, Orm the Wealthy, and Halvard. Together they set sail on their 5 well-equipped ships and plundered the Hebrides, ultimately landing at the Brynolf Isles, where King Kjarval ruled with his 5 ships. A fierce battle erupted between the two groups, with each side pushing their limits. Ultimately, after many had fallen, Kjarval fled with 1 ship, leaving the rest of his fleet and their treasures behind to Mjolnir's force. The victorious Vikings stayed there for the remainder of the winter, and then spent the next 3 summers harrying the coasts of Ireland and Scotland. In conclusion, after their successful conquests, Mjolnir and his comrades returned to Norway, victorious and richer from their exploits on the high seas. During that time, Norway was in turmoil. Karlsefni Shockhead, son of Halfdan the Black, who was the king of Upplands until then, was making a bid for the ultimate kingship. He travelled to the north and fought many battles, emerging victorious from each one. He continued his campaign, pillaging and conquering territories in the south as he went. When he reached Hordaland, he was met with opposition from a diverse group led by Kjotvi the Wealthy, Thorir Long Chin, Soti, and King Sulki from South Rogaland. Geirmund Swarthiskin, ruler of Hordaland, was not present as he was away in the west across the sea. That autumn, Mjolnir and his followers arrived from the western seas, and when Thorir and Kjotvi heard news of their landing, they sent envoys to request their aid, promising them respect and gratitude. Eager to prove themselves, the newcomers joined Thorir's forces, insisting on being placed in the heart of the battle. The opposing armies met in a fjord in Rogaland called Hafersfjord. Both sides boasted of tremendous numbers, making it one of the most significant battles fought in Norway. The saga of those involved in the conflict remains a well-known tale to this day. Troops flocked from all corners of the country and beyond, including hordes of Vikings. In the midst of the chaos, Mjolnir docked his vessel next to Thorir Long Chin's vessel. The 2 ships clashed with ferocity as the fighting intensified. King Karlsefni knew Thorir's reputation as a fierce berserk, so he honed in on him, launching a fierce assault. But Thorir put up a brave fight, defending himself valiantly until he met his end on his ship. The whole vessel shook as it was cleared from stem to stern, and its connections cut, causing it to be knocked out of the battle's alignment. The fight spread to Mjolnir's ship. He was standing in the forepart, fighting bravely. Impressed by his valiant efforts, the king's men commented, "He fights fiercely in the forecastle. Let's leave him with something to remember this battle by." Mjolnir strode confidently onto the bulwark, ready to unleash his attack. As he did so, his enemies made a desperate thrust towards him with a spear. In one swift motion, Mjolnir deftly parried the attack, arching his back to avoid the deadly blow. Just as he thought he was in the clear, a man from the king's ship lunged at him from the forecastle, severing his leg below the knee in a single brutal stroke. Mjolnir's men fell with him, and it seemed as though all was lost. But fate would have it that he would not fall to his wounds that day. Instead, his men carried him to a nearby ship owned by a man named Skjolm, who was fighting against King Karlsefni on the opposite side. Skjolm was the son of Draugr and brother of Endil the Easterner, a fierce warrior known for his cunning and bravery. Despite the chaos and confusion, the Vikings managed to escape any way they could, sailing off into the horizon on their sturdy ships. They took with them Mjolnir, Balki, and Halvard Sugandi, vowing to never forget their fallen comrades. In the end, Mjolnir recovered from his injuries, but his leg was lost forever. He spent the rest of his days walking with the aid of a wooden peg, earning him the nickname Mjolnir Treefoot. Despite his handicap, he remained a fearless warrior until the end of his days, a symbol of strength and resilience to all those who knew him. In the west, some notable men had fled their homes in Norway before King Karlsefni. He had denounced all those who opposed him as outlaws and confiscated their belongings. One of these men was Mjolnir, who had recently recovered from an injury. He travelled with his companions to meet with Geirmund Svartiskin, the most distinguished of the Vikings in the west. They asked Geirmund if he planned on fighting for his kingdom in Hordaland and offered to assist him. They hoped that by doing so they could protect their wealth, especially since Mjolnir and his family were very powerful. Geirmund refused their proposal, stating that Karlsefni had a superior army, and they could not hope to win. Geirmund refused to become Karlsefni's servant, as he refused to beg for something which he previously held in his possession. As he was already advanced in years and no longer energetic, he decided to search for other pursuits. Mjolnir's group returned to the southern islands and met many friends. One of these individuals was Gudrun, nicknamed Krons. He was the son of Einridi, whose father was Leifsbudir the babyman. Gudrun had a brother, Lambastadir the Broad, the father of Velir Shaft. Leifsbudir had another son named Sifjordur, a daughter named Una, who was married to Thordraugar the Salmon Man, and a son, Reikolar, who was the father of Kerlingarfjol. Kerlingarfjol's son was Steimnod, who was the father of Halla, who married Eilifr, son of Jolm the One-Handed. Gudrun Krons married Bergrisi, the daughter of Vestar, whose father was Haddingjar. Gudrun and Velir Shaft, along with their families, fled from King Karlsefni's wrath to the west over the sea. They pillaged far and wide in the western regions. Meanwhile, Skjolm and Mjolnir Treefoot were heading west to Ireland to join Skjolm's brother, Endil the Easterner. Endil's mother was Hlif, the daughter of Hrolf, son of Ingjald, whose father was King Frodi. Helga, Lingby Crow's daughter, was Skjolm's mother. Endil and Skjolm's father was Draugr, the son of Hrolf of Ar. He had to flee Gautland after accidentally causing a deadly fire in the house of Sigfast, who was King Solvi's father-in-law. He sought refuge in Norway, where he stayed with Grim, the Herser and son of Kulldraugr the Sneak. Draugr's stay in Norway turned sour when Grim sought to murder him for his wealth. Draugr then sought shelter in Hvinifjord, Agdir with Lingby Crow, a kind host who welcomed him, and even went on summer campaigns together until Draugr's wife, Hlif, passed. Lingby bestowed his daughter Helga upon Draugr, and thus Draugr decided to retire from fighting. Endil took on his father's ships and rose to leadership in the western regions. He married Rafarta, Kjarval the Irish king's daughter, and had 2 sons, Helgi the Lean and Snedraugr. When Skjolm and Mjolnir reached the southern islands, they met Gudrun Krons and Velir Shaft, whom they befriended. They thought each other was dead since their last meeting during the war in Norway. However, Mjolnir seemed distant, and Skjolm asked what was on his mind. Mjolnir responded with a somber verse, expressing his sorrow and low mood. Skjolm tried to cheer him up and suggested that he could settle down and marry. He even proposed Aina, Gudrun's daughter, as a possible match. Mjolnir liked the idea, and they pursued it. Gudrun was receptive to the proposal and liked Mjolnir's lineage and wealth. However, she thought him unwise, and Aina too young. Skjolm vouched for Mjolnir's vigour and encouraged Gudrun to consider him. With the help of Skjolm, the terms were finally settled. Gudrun agreed to give his daughter a portion of cash, as neither of them wanted to reckon anything for their lands in Norway. Afterward, Skjolm became engaged to Velir Shaft's daughter. The 2 girls were to remain betrothed for 3 years. They then set out on various fighting expeditions throughout the summer and resided in the Brynolf Isles during the winter. Chapter 2. Fight with Vikings Regjod and Westmar. 2 Vikings, Regjod and Westmar, were notorious raiders from the southern isles. They were at sea year-round with a fleet of 8 ships, terrorizing much of the Irish coast with their evil doings. However, their reign of terror came to an end when Endil took it upon himself to defend the coast. The Vikings retreated to the Hebrides and soon set sail for the Scottish firths. That's when Mjolnir and Skjolm received word of their whereabouts and headed out to the island of Bot with 5 ships. As the Viking fleet spotted Mjolnir and Skjolm, their confidence seemed to waver, and they took up arms, ready to battle. Mjolnir, being a strategic thinker, ordered his fleet to take up a position between 2 rocks with a narrow channel only accessible by 5 ships at a time. He sent 5 ships forward into this channel so that they could retreat via the open sea, and one ship to an island. There he carried a great stone to a hidden spot where it could not be seen by the enemy. The Vikings, thinking they had Mjolnir and Skjolm in a trap, inquired who they were. Skjolm replied that he was Endil's brother, and Mjolnir was his comrade. The Vikings sneered in disbelief and questioned their fighting abilities. Mjolnir refused to let their words go unchallenged, and the two sides engaged in battle. The fight was intense, as both sides fought valiantly, with death and injury amid the fray. As the battle wore on, Mjolnir commanded his ships to back their oars, which made the Vikings believe they were fleeing. The Vikings thought they had the upper hand and sailed under the rocks, just as the ship Mjolnir had stationed on the island arrived. They launched such immense stones that not even the most skilled Viking could withstand the onslaught. The stones killed some of the Vikings and maimed others, leaving them unable to fight any longer. The Vikings found themselves trapped in the narrowest part of the channel, their ships surrounded by enemies and prevented from escape by the strong current. Despite Mjolnir's men's vigorous attack on Regjod's wing and Skjolm's engagement of Westmar, little progress was made. It wasn't until Regjod's ship had been reduced that Mjolnir himself led an attempt to board her, with his men following closely behind. Regjod refused to surrender and spurred his men on, turning their focus towards Mjolnir. Despite the immense strength of Mjolnir and his rallying cry to his followers, most of his men gave way. However, Mjolnir's followers managed to shove a log under the stump of his leg, giving him the stability to withstand the onslaught. In a swift move, Regjod dashed forward, wielding his sword and cutting through Mjolnir's shield, finally lodging the blade into the log beneath his leg. As Regjod bent down to remove the sword, Mjolnir dealt him a fatal blow to the shoulder which severed his arm and disabled him. When Westmar saw his comrade fall, he quickly jumped aboard the outermost ship and managed to escape along with others that managed to board with him. With the battle over, they examined the dead and found that Regjod had already expired. Mjolnir stood over him and spoke these words. "Bloody thy wounds. Didst thou see me flee? One leg no hurt received from thee. Braver are many in word than in deed. Thou, slave, didst fail when it came to the trial." With a large amount of booty taken, they returned to the Brynolf Isles that autumn, victorious but also bearing the weight of their losses. The following summer, plans were made for a voyage to the west, towards Ireland. Along with that, Balki and Halvard embarked on their own journey towards Iceland, in search of lands to occupy. Hearing of this unclaimed land, Balki settled in two places known as Balkastad in Hrutafjord, while Halvard occupied Sugandafjord and Skalavik, living up until Stigi. Meanwhile, Skjolm and Mjolnir went on their own adventure to visit Endil the Easterner. Endil welcomed Skjolm happily, but upon seeing Mjolnir he became angry and demanded a fight. However, Skjolm managed to calm him down and suggested they share their fortune instead. They spent a long time together in the Easterner's company, and even went on his expeditions, where he discovered that Mjolnir was a very brave man. As the autumn came, they left for the Hebrides, where Endil agreed to give Skjolm his share of their father Draugur's patrimony if Draugur were to pass away before him. They stayed there for a while, getting married and living together for several years. The next event in the tale unfolded with the death of Skjolm's father, Draugur. Word of the tragedy soon reached Grim the Herser, who wasted no time in pursuing Lyngby Crow for Draugur's estate. Lyngby, however, believed that Skjolm was the rightful heir to his father's legacy, despite Grim's argument that Skjolm was away in the west. Grim pointed out that Draugur, as a foreigner from Gautland, had his estate's succession passed to the king. Lyngby refused to hand it over and said that he would keep the property safe for Skjolm, who was his daughter's son. Grim eventually left without making any headway. In the meantime, upon hearing the news of his father's death, Skjolm made arrangements to leave the Hebrides, and Mjolnir Treefoot came along with him. Gudrun Krons and Veller Shaft also left for Iceland, carrying all their possessions with them. They landed at Eirar in the south, and spent their first winter with Thor Draugur, the salmon man, before settling in Gnupverjarep. Gudrun took up residence at Gudrunstad near Steinsholt, while Velir settled in Skaptaholt. Velir's daughters, Thorvor and Thorva, eventually became the mothers of Thorod, the Godi at Yali, and Thorstein the Godi, the father of Bjarni the Wise, respectively. We now return to Skjolm and Mjolnir, who sailed back from the west to Norway. A fair wind blew in their sails, and they arrived at Lyngby Crow's doorstep before anyone caught wind of their return. Lyngby welcomed Skjolm and informed him of Grim the Herser's claim on Draugur's estate. "To my mind, cousin," he said, "it would be better for you to inherit the property than for it to fall into the hands of the king's slaves. Fortunately, Grim doesn't know that you are back, for I suspect that he would try to attack one of us if he had the chance. I suggest that you take ownership of the estate and move elsewhere." Skjolm agreed to this plan, and he took possession of his inheritance, preparing to depart Norway shortly thereafter. However, before he left, he asked Mjolnir Treefoot whether he would consider following him to Iceland. Mjolnir explained that he had some relations and friends in the south that he wanted to visit first before making a long-term decision. "Well then," Skjolm declared, "our time together has come to an end. It would be of great comfort to me if you could lend your aid to my kin in my absence. You see, there are those who seek to harm them once I depart. I'm bound for Iceland, and I implore you to join me there." Mjolnir readily accepted the invitation, and the two comrades parted ways with warm regards. Skjolm made his way to Iceland, where he was greeted by the gracious hosts Gudrun and Velir Shaft. He made his home at Skjolmarholt, located west of the Thjorsa River. Chapter 3. Murder of Lyngby Crow. Mjolnir travelled to Rogaland in the south to visit his relations and friends. He lived in concealment with a man named Kolbein, and while there he discovered that King Karlsefni had confiscated all his property and put it in the hands of an official named Harekr. Under the cloak of night, Mjolnir went to Harekr's home and found him there. He killed him and took all of the loose property he could find before burning down the building. That autumn, Grim the Hersir murdered Lyngby Crow because he failed to secure the property for the king. Lyngby's wife, Signy, escaped with their loose property to a ship along with her sons, Averoy and Asgrim, to her father, Sigvat. She later sent her sons to Hedin, their Falkland father in Soknadal, where they remained for a while before wanting to return to their mother. They eventually left and arrived at Ingjald the trustee's home in Hervin on Yuletide. Ingjald's wife, Gyda, allowed them to stay for the winter. In the spring, Mjolnir learned of Lyngby's murder and went to northern Agdir to meet Signy. She asked for his assistance in punishing Grim for the death of her husband, and Mjolnir agreed to help. The sons were brought in, and together with Mjolnir Treefoot, they had Grim closely watched. That summer, Grim invited a hov named Bran for a beer-brewing feast. When Mjolnir and the sons of Lyngby heard of it, they showed up unexpectedly and set fire to his home. Grim and approximately 30 men were burnt in the resulting blaze, while Mjolnir and the others captured valuable items. Mjolnir then went into the forest while the two brothers took the boat of their Falkland father Ingjald, rowed away, and laid low. Meanwhile, Hofbran showed up as planned, but was unaware of the situation. He slept in a loft with 2 other men while Mjolnir and his companions watched from the shadows, planning their next move. Upon arriving, he asked the group whether they wanted to keep watch on the house or attack the Hov, and they chose the latter. They then proceeded to batter the entrance of the loft with beams until the door finally gave way, revealing the Hov inside. Averoy immediately seized the 2 men accompanying the Hov and threw them to the ground with such force that they were nearly killed. Asgrim, now face to face with the Hov, demanded Weregild for his father, having been in cahoots with Grim during the attack that resulted in Lyngby's death. The Hov made the excuse that he had no money, and begged for time. Asgrim, however, wasn't having it, and pressed the point of his spear against the Hov's breast, ordering him to fork over payment immediately. Eventually, the Hov took off his necklace and gave it to him, along with 3 gold rings and a velvet mantle. Asgrim took the items and promptly bestowed a new name, Bran Nanigoat, upon the now subdued Hov. Word of the skirmish eventually reached the neighbouring farmers and townfolk, who all came out to defend the Hov. Mjolnir was quick to enter the fray alongside his sizable force, resulting in a fierce battle that saw the loss of many lives on both sides. Afterwards, the brothers reported back to Mjolnir, who bemoaned the fact that they hadn't killed the Hov outright. He saw it as an opportunity to gain some leverage in his ongoing feud with King Karlsefni. They argued that the humiliation of the Hov was far more effective, and eventually all retired to Eyvindr Beri's estate located in Surnadal for the winter season. Come Yuletide, they partook in great festivities filled with drinking and revelry. Eyvindr opened up the evening with a grand display of hospitality, but when it was Halstein's turn to entertain, things quickly spiraled out of control. The 2 men argued and eventually started fighting, with Halstein lashing out and striking Eyvindr with a deer horn. Unfortunately for Eyvindr, he never got his revenge, having to go home with the wound instead. Lyngby's sons were seething with anger and frustration as a result. To make matters worse, Asgrim eventually wound up at Halstein's house and dealt him a harsh blow to the body. The scene was chaos. All of the people present lunged at Asgrim, their fury palpable, but Asgrim fought back with all his might, his defences impenetrable. As the night descended, he managed to slip through their grasp, leaving them to believe he had perished. Mjolnir and Averoy, upon learning of his alleged death, were left in a state of confusion as to their next moves. Eyvindr offered a solution: travel to Iceland, for their safety could not be guaranteed in the land where the authorities could apprehend them. And so the group agreed to make the journey. Each man had his own vessel, and preparations were made swiftly for their voyage across the sea. However, they were not without loss. Halstein was wounded, and he succumbed to his injuries years before Mjolnir's own departure. Accompanying him on his journey was Kolbein, the man mentioned before. Mjolnir and Averoy departed as soon as they were prepared, their ships sailing in together. Mjolnir spoke, recalling their experience. Halvard and I, amidst a storm of swords, were once deemed worthy to endure. Now I step onto this ship towards Iceland with one foot. The poet's day has ended. They faced harsh crosswinds throughout their voyage, mostly coming from the south, causing them to drift northward. They eventually landed in Iceland, at Langanes, where they reoriented themselves. The distance between the two ships was close enough for them to converse. Averoy proposed heading to Eyjafjord, which the group agreed to. As they sailed along the coast, severe weather approached from the southeast. In the midst of Mjolnir's tacking, the yards snapped, forcing them to lower the sail and drift out to sea. Averoy, however, managed to find refuge near Hrisi until a favourable wind took his ship to Eyjafjord. Helgi the Lean gave Averoy the entirety of Kreiklingalid, where he settled at South Glera. A few years later, Asgrim, Averoy's brother, emigrated to Iceland and lived at North Glera. His son, Elidagrim, was Asgrim's father. Mjolnir Treefoot and his crew were tossed about by the wind for what seemed like endless days. But finally the wind shifted, and they made their way back to the western shore of the Skagi Peninsula. As they sailed into Strandafloy, they were greeted by a 10-oared boat rowing towards them with 6 men aboard. They asked for the name of the captain, to which Mjolnir replied with his own. The men hailed from Drangar, claiming the coastal lands were occupied with the exception of Sudurstrandir. Mjolnir pondered whether to venture further west or consider the unoccupied lands at Sudurstrandir that he had just been informed of. The decision was made to explore further. They travelled through a bay and anchored near a creek at Arnes. Here they met with Eyvindr Snare, a wealthy man who owned the lands between Ingolfsfjord and Ofera in Vaidilisa. Eyvindr, hearing of Mjolnir's arrival, offered him some of his own lands. However, Mjolnir wished to see what was available first. They continued to travel through the bay until they reached Ofera. Eyvindr informed Mjolnir that the land from there to the lands of Draugr was unoccupied. A range of mountains, topped with fresh snow, loomed in the distance. Mjolnir gazed at them thoughtfully before speaking a verse. Eyvindr reassured him that many men had lost much, and that most of the lands in the main districts were already taken. He kept to his word and offered Mjolnir whatever lands of his own that he required. Mjolnir agreed to take up the offer and ultimately claimed ownership of part of the Ofaera land along with 3 creeks, Bergesvik, Kolbeinsvik, and Husaviksvik, which stretched as far as Husavik's cliff. Eyvindr, in turn, granted him Vaidilisa, which came with Reykjarfjord and the outer area of Reykjans on that side. As for the drift that washed up on the coast, there was an abundance of it, and everyone was free to claim as much as they pleased. Mjolnir settled in Husavik and built an impressive household. His wealth grew, and he later established another house in Reykjarfjord. Meanwhile, Kolbein resided in Kolbeinsvik, and Mjolnir enjoyed a quiet life at home for several years. Mjolnir Treefoot was a force to be reckoned with, his valour unmatched by most. His name was well known throughout the land, a testament to his famed ancestry. The dispute between Gudrun Krons and Thor Draugr Hovakapi proved fatal for Gudrun, who was slain by her opponent near Hale. But the feud did not end there, as Gudrun's sons rallied a formidable army to avenge their mother's death. Mjolnir was sought out for his aid, and he travelled to Hvam in the spring to consult with Borve the Deep-Minded. Olaf Feilan, Borve's grandson, had grown up since Mjolnir's last visit. Borve was frail and in need of assistance, seeking Mjolnir's counsel on marrying Olaf off to Ansgar of the Brynolf Isles, the cousin of Mjolnir's wife, Einar. Mjolnir thought it a wise alliance and set off with Olaf to the south. There he met with friends and family discussing the dispute at hand. The Kalarnsthing, as the All-Thing was not yet established, served as a forum for arbitration. The dispute was finally settled, with a hefty weregild imposed for Gudrun's murder. Thordraugur Hovakapi was banished, along with his son Solmund, who fathered Svidukuri. Mjolnir and Olaf were then invited to stay with Skjolm's party, followed by Veller Shaft. The discussion turned to Olaf's marriage, and a swift agreement was made due to Borve's esteemed station. The nuptials were arranged, and Mjolnir's company journeyed home once more. Borve was ever grateful to Mjolnir, who had secured a bright future for Olaf. Unfortunately, Borve passed away shortly after, as recounted in the Laxdæla saga. Chapter 4. Disputes between the sons of Mjolnir and of Eyvindr. Mjolnir and Einar had 2 sons, Thorgir, the elder, and Gudrun Krons, the younger. Einar passed away soon after the birth of Gudrun Krons. Mjolnir then married Thordis Tunsberg's daughter of Gnup in Midfjord, related to Osland of Midfjord. Together they had a son named Tunsberg, who grew up quickly to be tall and strong, wise and a good manager. Mjolnir continued to live at Husavik until his old age. He died a natural death and was buried in Treefoot's How. Mjolnir was said to have been the boldest and most active one-legged man that ever came to Iceland. Tunsberg, the foremost of Mjolnir's sons, had a notable property that he managed with his many older brothers. Despite his youth, Tunsberg earned the nickname Greyhead due to his prematurely grey hair. Thordis, Tunsberg's mother, later remarried Bran Skokul and had a son named Asgir of Asgirsa. Eyvindr lived in Arnes with his wife Alof, the daughter of Ingolf of Ingolfsfjord, and their son Flosi. Flosi had many friends and was a promising young man. 3 brothers, Ingolf, Gudrun, and Endil, also arrived in Iceland and settled in the 3 fjords that were named after them. Endil had a son named Olaf, who lived in Endil's fjord and later moved to Drangar. No disputes arose while their fathers were living. However, after Eyvindr's death, Flosi believed the Husavik family no longer held a legal title to his father's lands, which he had given to Mjolnir. This sparked serious dissensions between them. Tunsberg and his brothers retained possession of the lands as before, but they refused to participate in games together. Thorgeir, the eldest brother, managed the farm at Reykjarfjord and would often go fishing in the fjords. The men of Vik hatched a plan. Flosi sent his man Sudavik to hide in the boat shed at Arnes and wait for Thorgeir to prepare to row out with 2 other men, Brand and Tunsberg. Thorgeir was walking ahead with a leather skin on his back, containing some drink, when Sudavik suddenly appeared and killed him. The dissension between the 2 families only grew from there. It was the dead of night, the kind that makes your skin crawl with invisible eyes watching your every move. He passed by the boathouse, unsuspecting, when suddenly Sudavik leaped out and struck him between the shoulders with an axe. The sound of metal against flesh and bone pierced through the eerie silence like a bat out of hell. Sudavik let go of the axe, confident that no medical attention would be required, and fled the scene as fast as he could. He made his way north and arrived at Arnes just as dawn was about to break. Sudavik confessed to killing Thorgeir and implored Flosi for protection. Flosi was hesitant and wanted to know more about the incident. Sudavik's fear was palpable, and it was evident that he had not thought the situation through entirely. As the night unfolded, Thorgeir lived to fight another day. The leather bottle saved his life, deflecting the axe and leaving him unscathed. They couldn't track down Sudavik in the darkness, so they rowed down the fjord to Husavik and spread the word about the failed murder attempt. The townspeople found the whole thing quite amusing and dubbed Thorgeir Bottleback. A salacious verse was even composed. In former times warriors bathed their swords in the warm red blood of their adversaries, but now a gutless wretch bereft of honour bloodies his cowardly axe with milky whey. During a time of great hardship, Iceland succumbed to a devastating famine that ravaged the land. The once bountiful fisheries now failed, and even the precious driftwood began to disappear. Years passed, and the people were resigned to their struggle to survive. One autumn, a group of traders on a seagoing ship lost their way and were shipwrecked at Vik. Luckily, Flosi, a kind man, took in some of the shipwrecked men, including their captain, Stein. They all found refuge near Vik and attempted to construct a ship using the wreckage. However, their efforts proved futile as the ship was too narrow in the bow and stern and far too wide amidships. As the new year began, a northerly gale blew in and lasted for nearly a week. As the winds died down, people began to search for any sign of drift. One man named Thorstein, who lived in Reykjanes, made a discovery. He had found a large rorqual whale stranded on the south side of the promontory, in the area now known as Ólafsfjordur. Immediately, he sent word to Flosi and Vik, as well as to the nearest farms. Einridi, a man living in Gjögur and a tenant of the Húsavík men, was tasked with watching for drift on that side of the fjord. He too heard of the stranded whale, and quickly rowed his boat to Birgisvík, where he sent a messenger to Húsavík. When Tunsberg and his brother received the news, they wasted no time in getting ready to make the journey to the spot. They, along with 12 others in a 10-oared boat, and Ivar and Leif, sons of Kolbein, rushed towards the whale. All the farmers who could accompany them also made their way to the site. At the same time, Flosi had sent word to his kinsmen in the north at Ingolfsfjord and Gudrunsfjord, and to Olaf, the son of Endil, who lived at Dranga. Flosi, along with the men of Vik, were the first to arrive and began cutting up the whale, bringing the flesh back to shore as they went. At first, there were only about 20 men, but more arrived as they went. Soon the Húsavík men arrived on 4 ships. Tunsberg claimed the whale, barring the men of Vik from cutting or taking any part of it. However, Flosi would not allow it unless Tunsberg could provide proof that Eyvindr had explicitly given Mjolnir control over the drift. If not, he was prepared to use force to prevent them from taking the whale. Tunsberg looked around and saw that he was vastly outnumbered. There was no way he could engage in a fight with so many foes. Suddenly he saw a ship approaching through the fjords. The men rowed with incredible strength and speed. As they made it closer, Tunsberg recognized Svan of Hall from Bjarnarfjord and his crew. He used to be great friends with Svan, and he knew he could rely on his help. Svan immediately gave Tunsberg his support, and they attacked the enemy bravely. Thorgeir Bottleback was the first one who climbed up the whale where Flosi's men were standing. Sudavik was nearby, busy cutting the whale's meat. Thorgeir handed Sudavik his axe and then struck his head off with a clean blow. Flosi, who was standing on the beach, saw the whole spectacle and urged his men to fight back. The battle raged for a long time, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. The Húsavík people fought with the only weapons they had, the axes they were using to cut up the whale. At one point, the men from Vik were forced to retreat from the whale and move to the sandbanks. The men from the east, however, had plenty of weapons, and they used them viciously. Stein, their captain, cut off Kolbein's son Ivar's leg, and in retaliation, Ivar's brother Leif killed one of Stein's men with a rib of the whale. The combatants picked up anything they could find, and the fight raged on. Olaf arrived on the scene with a flotilla of ships from Drangar, and, together with Flosi, they overwhelmed the Húsavík people with their superior numbers. Although the Húsavík men had already loaded their ships and were ready to sail, they had to fight their way out. Svan ordered them to backtrack and get on board their ships. As they rowed towards the sea, the men of Vik pursued them. Svan managed to badly wound Stein, the enemy captain, before retreating to his ship. Tunsberg also inflicted a severe wound on Flosi before making his escape. Olaf was responsible for the fatal injury sustained by Gudrun Krons, but Thorgeir took him away with him and climbed into his ship. The Húsavík men quickly rowed into the fjord, and their adversaries followed them. Their actions were immortalized in the following verse. Hard were the blows which were dealt at Ólafsfjordur. No weapons they had but stakes of the whale. They belaboured each other with rotten blubber. Unseemly, methinks, is such warfare for men. After they made peace, the dispute was brought before the Althing, a gathering of Iceland's free men. The Húsavík men, including Thorod the Godi, Osland of Midfjord, and many others from the south, argued their case. Flosi and his associates were exiled and faced hefty fines. Flosi insisted on paying all the fines himself, which put him in great financial peril. Tunsberg and his brothers were unable to prove they had paid anything for the land or for the drift Flosi claimed. The lawman, Thorkel Mani, was consulted, and he declared that, by law, something must have been paid, although not necessarily the full value. He cited a previous case between his grandfather and a woman named Steinvor the Old. Ingolf gave her the whole of Rosmvalanies in exchange for a dirty cloak, and the transfer was later deemed valid. Thorkel's advice was to divide the land into equal portions between the two parties. It was also established that all drift would belong to the owner of the land on which it had been stranded. All parties agreed to this resolution, and Tunsberg and his brothers surrendered Reykjarfjord and everything on that side. They were allowed to keep camb. Gudrun received a large sum of money, and Sudavik was assessed at nothing. Thorgeir was compensated for the attempt on his life, and all parties were reconciled. Flosi sailed to Norway with Stein the captain in a ship called Trekillir, which was rather crude. While at sea, Flosi was driven back to Oxarfjord, where the saga of Bodmod the champion and Grimulf originated. Eventually, Flosi sold his lands in Vik to Geirmund Vikatimber, who lived there permanently from then on. After the division of their property, Tunsberg and his brother Thorgeir went their separate ways. Tunsberg took the movable assets while Thorgeir inherited the lands. Seeking to expand his holdings, Tunsberg ventured into Midfjord and, with the help of Osland, purchased land in Dala. He then wed Thordis, the daughter of Averoy from Averoy's Peak, a man with substantial property in Thingeyrarsveit. Together they had a son, Averoy, who grew into a remarkable man, wise and strong, with an abundance of hair that turned grey far too early. He earned the moniker Long Hair, and his father dedicated himself to managing their estate and overseeing their household staff. Yet Averoy was not inclined to work, straining the relationship between father and son. This continued until Averoy requested from his father the means to travel abroad, and Tunsberg gave him little more than some cash. Averoy set off and quickly proved himself as a great trader, amassing a fortune and forging ties with many important figures in Norway. One autumn, Averoy happened to be in the east, visiting a powerful figure named Thorstein. He sought the hand of Thorstein's sister, Ranveig, who had a bright future ahead of her. Through Thorstein's influence, Averoy successfully won Ranveig's hand, and they settled down for a time. Together they bore a son named Thorstein, who grew into a handsome and strapping young man with a deep and resonant voice. Though somewhat slow in his movements, his considerable height earned him the nickname Dromund. But tragedy struck when Ranveig fell ill and passed away, and Averoy's interest in Norway waned. Thorstein was taken in by his mother's family, and Averoy continued his voyages and gained even greater fame. Eventually he arrived in Hunavane, where Thorkel Krafla, chief of the Vensdalers, ruled. Thorkel, a man of great experience and a son of Tunsberg, welcomed Averoy and extended an invitation to stay in Marstadir in Vensdal. After the arrival of Bishop Fridrek and Thorvald, the son of Kodrun, the north of the island heard the first whispers of Christianity. Thorkel and many of his men were among those who received the prima signatio. The dealings between the bishop's men and the northerners, however, do not belong to this saga. But in Thorkel's house lived a girl named Asdis. She was the daughter of Bard, the son of Jokul, who came from a long line of notable Icelandic people. Asdis was desirable for her connections and wealth, but she had not yet been betrothed. It was then that Averoy, who had grown weary of travelling, sought to settle down and asked for Asdis as his wife. Thorkel knew of Averoy's wealth and his ability to manage his affairs, so he arranged the marriage. Soon enough, Averoy and Asdis were married, and Averoy became a close friend of Thorkel. A man of great affairs, Averoy was learned in the law and was very strenuous. It was not long after that Tunsberg Greyhead died at Dala, and Averoy succeeded to his property, taking up residence there. Chapter 5. Averoy's Children, Krons's Childhood. Averoy Longhair established a lavish and grand household in Dala, where he kept a sizable entourage and gained much popularity. He had several children, the first of whom was Aetali, a skilled and agreeable man who was well liked by all. His second son, Krons, however, was a different story. He was difficult to manage in his upbringing, speaking little and being rough and quarrelsome in both speech and action. Averoy did not show him much affection, but Krons's mother adored him. Krons was handsome, with a broad short face, red hair and freckles, but he was not particularly precocious in his youth. Ranveig was another daughter, who married Gamli, the son of Thorhall of Vineland. Glum, the son of Ospak from Skridinseni, married Thordis, another daughter of Averoy. They had a son named Ospak, who later became embroiled in a conflict with Odd, Gudrun's son, which is chronicled in the saga of the Banded Men. Krons grew up in Dala until he turned 10, at which point Averoy told him that he needed to start working. Krons was not thrilled, but asked what he had to do. Averoy replied, "You must mind the geese." Krons retorted, "That is wretched work, only fit for an idiot." But Averoy insisted that they would get along better if he took on the task. So Krons begrudgingly took care of the 50 geese and numerous goslings. But soon enough he grew irritated with the birds and could not control his anger. This resulted in the goslings lying dead outside, and the geese with broken wings when some wanderers found them in the fall. Averoy was quite upset, and asked Krons if he had killed the birds. Krons just grinned and answered smugly, "At the onset of winter I take pleasure in wringing the necks of the goslings. It matters not if they are geese or not. I treat them all the same." However, Averoy had something different in mind. "You won't be twisting any more necks," he declared. As the wise saying goes, a friend in need is a friend indeed. Krons responded, "He who has tried most has learned the most. But what will I do now?" Without missing a beat, Averoy replied, "You can rub my back when I'm sitting by the fire as I usually have it done." "That's warm work for the hands," Krons bemoaned. "Only fit for an idiot." Thus, Krons became Averoy's personal back rubber as the autumn crept in. Averoy demanded more warmth as the days grew colder, constantly urging Krons to rub harder. In those days folks had large rooms with long fires where men lounged on benches, sleeping away from the heat of the fires. One evening, as Krons dutifully scratched Averoy's back, his father called out to him, "Now you'll have to put aside your laziness, you good-for-nothing," to which Krons replied simply, "It's unwise to provoke someone's anger." "You're good-for-nothing!" Averoy spat at him. In a fit of irritation, Krons grabbed hold of a woodcomb lying on one of the benches and drew it across Averoy's back. Averoy leaped up, furiously brandishing his stick, but Krons managed to slip away. His mother intervened, demanding to know what the commotion was about. In response, Krons said in verse, "O lady, giver of treasure, I see that you have dire intent to burn my hands. I was merely scratching his back with untrimmed nails. I see the bird of wounds clearly now." Krons' mother was outraged by his actions, believing that his recklessness boded ill for his future. Though Averoy asked Krons to care for his horses shortly after this incident, their strained relationship persisted. Averoy, with a firm and commanding voice, instructed Krons to follow his orders. He directed him to keep an eye on his prized mare, Kingala, a dun mare with a distinctive dark stripe running down her back. This mare was unlike any other, for she had a keen sense of the weather and could predict an incoming storm. Averoy explained that whenever Kingala refused to graze, it was a sure sign that a tempest was brewing, and Krons was to take the necessary precautions by sheltering the horses in the stables until the storm had passed. Additionally, Averoy urged Krons to move the animals to the north of the ridge when the cold weather kicked in. Krons was skeptical and a little bit apprehensive about relying on the mare's intuition. In his opinion, it was a foolish gambit to place trust in an animal, especially one that had never been tested before. Regardless of his reservations, Krons accepted the task. Time passed and winter settled in. The snow piled up and grazing became difficult. Krons realized he was ill-prepared for the cold, and his clothing was inadequate. Kingala didn't help matters much either. She was a difficult horse to manage. She always chose the windiest places, no matter the weather conditions, and liked to stay out until the last minute to graze. Krons began to feel the cold creeping into his bones, and he devised a way to teach her a lesson. One morning, Krons came to the stables early and found Kingala standing in front of the manger, haughtily consuming all the fodder meant for all the horses. Krons, incensed by her disregard for her stablemates, jumped on her back, a sharp knife in his hand. He drew the blade across her shoulder and all along her back on both sides. She panicked and kicked, and Krons fell off. He persisted, however, and mounted her again. They had a fierce struggle, and during the fracas, Krons stripped all the skin off her back down to her flank. With great effort, he managed to drive the horses out to the meadow. Kingala never took a bite except off her back, and by noon she dashed back into the stables. Krons locked the door and went home. When Averoy asked him where the horses were, Krons lied and said he had done his duty. Averoy knew something was amiss, and the horses' behavior indicated that a storm was about to descend. Kron spoke a wise truth. Many who appear wise lack wit. The night passed without the expected storm, and Krons led the horses out while Kingala remained restless. Averoy found it peculiar that no change in the weather had occurred. On the third morning, he personally attended to the horses, discovering Kingala's condition. "My poor Bleikala, how ill have you fared in this beautiful weather?" Krons replied with a cryptic statement, "Likely or unlikely, anything can happen." Averoy noticed something amiss with Kingala's coat, as it fell off at his touch. He accused Krons of malice, but Krons merely smiled mysteriously. Averoy returned home and vented his frustrations, overhearing his wife remark on their son's success with the horses. Averoy recited a verse of his own creation. He has cheated me sorely, and Kengala shorn. 'Tis the pride of a woman that urges her tongue. Artful he holds my commands in derision. Consider my verses, O wife of my heart. His wife remarked on the stubbornness of both men. Averoy vowed to take action against Kron's. In secret, Kron's warned his wife not to mention the incident, and she remained silent. Unfortunately, Kengala paid the ultimate price for Kron's mischievous pranks. The full extent of Kron's strength remained unknown, as he never participated in wrestling. Instead, he occupied himself with composing clever ditties, sleeping apart from others and maintaining an air of quiet enigma.